Rain fell over Seattle in thin gray threads, the kind that never announced itself with thunder, but simply settled into the bones of the city and stayed there. The plaza outside the downtown police headquarters glistened under the streetlights, puddles catching the reflection of passing headlights, like scattered coins nobody bothered to pick up. It was the kind of autumn evening when the whole city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, though nobody could have said what. Through that mist walked a woman named Dr. Zariah Monroe, carrying an old leather case that had seen better decades, her coat collar turned up against the chill. Inside that case was a file that could end the careers of dozens of officials before the sun rose again. She did not know, not yet, that within 15 minutes her quiet arrival would bring the mayor's motorcade screaming through those very doors. Zariah moved without hurry, the way people do when they have already survived worse nights than this one. She was 39 years old, a forensic financial investigator, and special advisor to a federal anti-corruption task force, though nothing about her appearance suggested any of that. Her coat was plain, her shoes practical, her expression unreadable, and the leather case swinging gently at her side looked more like something a schoolteacher might carry than a vessel for classified federal evidence. She had learned long ago that power announced quietly does more damage than power announced loudly, and so she never corrected the assumptions people made about her. Tonight, those assumptions would nearly cost the city everything. Seattle at that hour looked like a city built entirely out of reflections, its windows and wet asphalt doubling every light until the streets seemed to glow from beneath. Buses hissed past nearly empty, their windows fogged, carrying the last stragglers of a workday that had ended hours earlier for everyone except the people whose jobs never truly stopped. Somewhere above the low clouds, a plane descended toward the airport, its lights blinking faintly through the haze, unnoticed by almost everyone below, except perhaps Zariah, who had always found a strange comfort in watching things move steadily toward their destination, despite the weather working against them. She had walked this route before, though never with quite so much riding on the outcome, and she knew every crack in the sidewalk leading up to the precinct steps the way other people knew the layout of their own kitchens. Tonight, however, felt different in a way she could not entirely name, a faint electricity in the wet air that made her tighten her grip on the handle of the old leather case, just slightly more than usual. At the entrance, a security guard glanced up from his post and did a poor job of hiding his skepticism. He asked for identification, and she produced a plain card, the kind that told him nothing except a name and a department. Two officers nearby exchanged a look, the particular look of men who had already decided who belonged in a building and who did not, regardless of what any card might say. One of them muttered something under his breath about people who show up after hours claiming urgent business, and the other laughed quietly, not bothering to lower his voice enough to keep her from hearing it. Zariah said nothing. She simply waited, the rain still clinging to her shoulders, her eyes calm in a way that unsettled anyone paying close enough attention. A young receptionist offered to call someone down to escort her, but before that could happen, the district's senior officer for the evening shift arrived, boots striking hard against the tile floor. Sergeant Travis Cole was 46 years old, built like a man who had once played football and never quite let go of the habit of taking up space in a room. He had a reputation for being right about everything, or at least for believing he was, and a well-known impatience for anyone who did not immediately explain themselves to his satisfaction. He looked Zariah over, from the worn case to the plain coat, to the water dripping off her sleeves, and something in his expression hardened before she had said a single word. It was the kind of judgment that took less than 3 seconds to form, and would take far longer than that to undo. "You're telling me this is classified material," Cole said, his voice carrying easily across the lobby, loud enough that a handful of officers glanced over from their desks. "I've never seen anyone carry federal documents in a bag that looks like it came from a thrift store." A few chuckles rippled through the room, quiet at first, then bolder, as no one moved to stop them. Zariah's face did not change. She reached into her coat and produced a small identification card, the kind issued only to a narrow circle of federal liaisons, and held it out without a word. Cole barely looked at it before waving it away, as though it were a magic trick performed by a street hustler rather than a legitimate credential. Behind him stood Officer Derek Mills, 29 years old, eager in the particular way of young men who have decided that impressing their superiors matters more than thinking for themselves. He had been on the force for 3 years, and had spent most of that time chasing the approval of men like Cole, hoping that one day it would translate into a promotion, a commendation, anything that proved he belonged. When Cole demanded that the case be opened right there in the lobby, Derek did not hesitate. He stepped forward before anyone gave the order explicitly, driven by the quiet hunger to be the one who acted first. Zariah looked at him then, not with fear, but with something closer to pity, as though she already understood exactly how this evening would end for him. "This case does not open for anyone without federal clearance," she said, her voice low and even, carrying none of the panic the room seemed to expect from her. Cole laughed outright this time, a short bark of disbelief, and told her that nobody outranked him inside his own precinct at this hour. He gestured for Derek to take the case, and the younger officer obeyed instantly, pulling it from her hands before she could react in any way that might have been read as resistance. Zariah let it go. She did not fight, did not raise her voice, did not do any of the things people expected a woman in her position to do when her life's work was suddenly in the hands of a stranger who had no idea what he was holding. Derek fumbled with the clasp, then simply forced it, the leather groaning under the pressure until it popped open. Inside lay a thick manila folder, sealed with a strip of red tape, the kind that marked material meant for exactly 3 sets of eyes in the entire state. A small metal tag was clipped to the corner, stamped with numbers that meant nothing to Derek, and everything to anyone who had ever worked alongside a federal task force. He pulled the folder free, turned it over once in his hands, as though weighing whether it was worth the trouble, and then, encouraged by Cole's low chuckle behind him, he tore the first page down the middle. The sound cut through the lobby like a gunshot, sharp and final, and for a moment even the officers who had been laughing went quiet. Nobody in that room understood what they were witnessing. Zariah did not scream, did not lunge forward, did not do anything except glance, briefly, at the clock mounted above the front desk. Derek tore a second page, emboldened now by the silence, by the absence of any resistance from the woman standing calmly a few feet away. Papers fluttered to the floor in halves, financial statements, and case notes scattering across the tile like confetti at the wrong kind of party. Cole crossed his arms and watched with obvious satisfaction, the posture of a man convinced he had just proven a point, though he could not have said precisely what point that was. "You just made the single worst mistake of your career," Zariah said quietly, and something in the way she said it, flat and certain, made even Derek pause with the next page halfway torn. Nobody laughed after that. The room seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, the way air shifts before a storm breaks, though none of them could have named the feeling. Cole told her to save her threats for someone who cared, and ordered 2 officers to begin processing her for obstruction, as though the fiction he had built in his own mind was somehow more real than the documents scattered across the floor. Zariah allowed herself to be led toward a bench near the holding area, without a single word of protest, her eyes never leaving the clock. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, rainwater still drying in her hair, while an officer began filling out a report that would later be described by federal attorneys as one of the most catastrophic paperwork errors in the department's history. Cole leaned against the front desk, recounting the story to anyone who would listen, embellishing it slightly each time, turning Zariah into a woman who had tried to bluff her way past trained professionals and failed. Derek stood nearby, still holding the torn folder, occasionally glancing at Zariah as though searching her face for some sign of the panic he expected, but never found. She did not call a lawyer. She did not ask for a phone. She simply asked, in a voice so calm it unsettled the officer taking her statement, how many minutes had passed. The clock read 6:48 when Cole first demanded she open the case, and by 7 o'clock, the mood in the precinct had curdled into something between smugness and boredom, the kind of atmosphere that settles over people who believe a situation has already been resolved. Officers wandered back to their desks, muttering jokes about the woman with the thrift store briefcase, while Zariah remained seated, watching the second hand crawl around the clock face, with the patience of someone counting down to an outcome only she could see coming. Cole made a comment about wasted paperwork, and a few officers laughed again, though the laughter felt thinner now, less certain, as though some part of them had begun to sense a wrongness in the room they could not yet identify. A young officer near the coffee station, one of the few who had not joined in the mockery earlier, found himself glancing repeatedly toward the bench where Zariah sat, unsettled by how little her posture had changed in the past 20 minutes. He noticed the way her eyes tracked the clock rather than the room around her, the way her breathing remained slow, and even despite everything that had just happened to the case she had carried through the rain. He considered, briefly, offering her a cup of coffee, then thought better of it, worried that any gesture of kindness might be read by his colleagues as a betrayal of the joke everyone else seemed determined to keep alive. Instead, he returned to his desk and busied himself with paperwork that suddenly felt far less important than it had an hour earlier, though he could not have explained why. Somewhere beyond the precinct walls, unheard by anyone inside, a series of phone calls had already begun, moving up a chain of command that stretched far beyond the reach of any single sergeant's authority. Nobody noticed the internal radio crackle to life at exactly 7:14. The voice on the radio was clipped and unfamiliar, carrying an authority that made every officer in the room straighten without quite understanding why. All units hold current position, it said, and repeat no further processing of any detainee until further notice. Cole frowned and reached for the radio himself, demanding clarification, but the channel had already gone silent, leaving only static and the low hum of the building's fluorescent lights. Derek looked toward Zariah again, and this time there was no mockery in his expression, only the first flicker of something that resembled fear. She did not look back at him. She simply watched the front doors, as though she had known all along exactly what was coming through them next. Captain Elena Brooks arrived at the precinct 11 minutes later, summoned by a phone call she would later describe as the most unsettling conversation of her career. She was 50 years old, with 2 decades on the force, and a reputation for running her division with a steadiness that rarely cracked. But the moment she stepped through the doors that evening, her expression told everyone in the room that something had gone badly wrong. She had received the call from a number she did not recognize, a voice identifying itself only as belonging to a federal liaison office, informing her that a classified asset under active protection had been detained inside her own precinct. She had asked for a name. The voice on the other end had given her one, and Elena had felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet when she heard it. She crossed the lobby quickly, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Zariah seated calmly near the holding area, then dropped to the torn papers still scattered across the floor near the front desk. Her stomach turned in a way she did not yet have the words to explain, though every instinct she had built over 20 years of service was screaming that this was not a minor incident to be smoothed over with an apology and a cup of coffee. She ordered every officer nearby to step back from the woman immediately, her voice carrying a sharpness that silenced the last of the lingering laughter in the room. Cole opened his mouth to explain himself, to recount the story the way he had told it a dozen times already that evening, but Elena held up a hand and told him this was no longer his decision to narrate. Outside, the low thrum of rotor blades began to grow louder over the sound of the rain, and within minutes, the beam of a spotlight swept briefly across the plaza windows before cutting out. A federal helicopter descended onto the small landing pad behind the precinct, an unusual sight for a building that rarely saw anything larger than a traffic patrol drone, and 2 agents, in dark jackets, stepped out before the rotors had even finished slowing. They moved through the rear entrance with the kind of efficient urgency that made even seasoned officers step aside without being asked. The first words out of the lead agent's mouth were not a greeting, but a demand, sharp and immediate, asking where Dr. Zariah Monroe could be found. Nobody in the room answered right away, because nobody in the room had yet understood what that title meant. Derek felt his stomach drop somewhere near his shoes, the torn folder still resting on the desk beside him, like physical evidence of a decision he was only now beginning to regret. He glanced toward Cole, hoping for some reassurance, some sign that this was still a situation the sergeant could talk his way out of, but Cole's jaw had tightened into a rigid line that suggested even he was beginning to understand the scale of what had happened. Elena stepped forward and gestured toward the bench, where Zariah sat exactly as she had for the past half hour, unmoved by the arrival of federal agents, the helicopter, or the sudden change in the room's atmosphere. One of the agents crossed the lobby quickly, knelt slightly to speak with her, and Zariah answered in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Cole, watching from a few feet away, finally spoke the words that would define the rest of his evening. "You are telling me she works for the federal government," he said, not quite a question, more a statement he was trying to convince himself was still open to negotiation. The agent who turned to answer him did not bother softening the response, informing Cole flatly that he had just destroyed evidence connected to an active federal investigation, evidence that existed nowhere else in any duplicated or digital form. The color drained from Cole's face in a way that Derek had never seen on his superior before, the confidence that had carried him through the entire evening collapsing all at once, like a building whose foundation had quietly rotted away long before anyone noticed the cracks. Elena stood very still, watching the two men she had trusted to run her evening shift responsibly, and felt something inside her harden into a resolve she would not let go of for the rest of the night. She did not yet know the full scope of what the folder had contained, but she understood, with total clarity, that the precinct she commanded had just become the center of a crisis far larger than any of them. Assistant United States Attorney Victor Hale arrived shortly after, moving through the lobby with the brisk authority of a man who had spent 20 years prosecuting cases most people never heard about until the headlines broke. He was 55 years old, silver at the temples, with the kind of unhurried composure that came only from having survived far worse rooms than this one. He nodded once to Zariah, a gesture of quiet respect rather than surprise, and then turned his attention to the officers gathered near the front desk, his expression giving away nothing of what he was about to say. He explained, in a voice pitched to carry across the entire lobby, that the folder torn apart on that floor had represented the only surviving original copy of evidence tied to the largest corruption investigation the city had seen in a generation. Every backup, he explained, existed only in encrypted form under federal seal, inaccessible, without authorization that would take weeks to process, weeks the investigation could not afford to lose. Cole's hands had begun to tremble slightly, though he tried to hide it by crossing his arms tighter across his chest, as if physical stillness could somehow undo the last half hour. Derek had gone entirely silent, staring at the torn pages on the floor as though they might reassemble themselves if he looked hard enough. Victor continued, explaining that the investigation had taken 5 years to build, that it involved dozens of officials across multiple departments, and that the physical file Zariah had been carrying contained handwritten annotations and chain of custody documentation that existed nowhere else, not on any server, not in any backup drive. Elena felt her own breath catch at the number, 5 years, and did the math without meaning to, calculating just how many people's careers, how many taxpayer dollars, how much public trust had been riding on a single leather case that had just been torn apart in her own lobby. Victor's final words before he turned away landed in the room like a verdict already decided. "The mayor is on his way," he said simply, and something about the plainness of the statement made it more chilling than any threat could have been. Cole opened his mouth as though to ask why the mayor himself would involve himself in what he still seemed to believe was a procedural misunderstanding, but no words came out. Derek looked toward the front doors, half expecting to see headlights already cutting through the rain, though it would still be several more minutes before that particular fear became reality. Elena ordered every officer not directly involved in the incident to clear the lobby, her voice carrying none of the patience she usually extended to her subordinates. The room emptied slowly, officers exchanging uneasy glances as they retreated toward their desks, leaving only Cole, Derek, Elena, Victor, and the 2 federal agents standing near the woman who had said almost nothing since the moment she walked through the door. The motorcade arrived 9 minutes later, a line of black vehicles cutting through the rain with an escort of motorcycle officers whose sirens had been silenced, but whose lights still washed the plaza in alternating red and blue. Mayor Nathaniel Cross stepped out of the lead car without waiting for an aide to open his door, an unusual gesture for a man known throughout the city for his careful, controlled public appearances. He was 58 years old, gray-haired, dignified in a way that had served him well through 3 election cycles, and tonight his face carried none of the polished neutrality the public was accustomed to seeing. He crossed the plaza quickly, rain soaking through his coat before he even reached the doors, and when he stepped into the lobby, he did not glance at Cole, did not acknowledge Elena's greeting, did not so much as look toward the cluster of officers still lingering near the front desk. He walked directly to where Zariah sat, and for a long moment he simply stood in front of her, the entire lobby, holding its breath around them. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, Nathaniel Cross bowed his head, not deeply, but unmistakably, a gesture no one in that building had ever seen him offer to anyone. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low but perfectly clear in the silence that had settled over the room. Zariah rose slowly from the bench, meeting his eyes without flinching, and for a moment, the two of them seemed to share an understanding that went far beyond the torn papers scattered across the tile floor. The mayor's apology was not performative, not the kind offered for cameras or press releases, but something quieter and more personal, the apology of a man who understood exactly what had almost been lost that evening. Cole watched the exchange with a growing sense of dread that had nothing left of the confidence he carried when the evening began. He had assumed, without ever quite admitting it to himself, that a woman like Zariah could not possibly hold the kind of authority that would bring the mayor of Seattle out into the rain at 7:30 at night. That assumption now stood exposed in front of everyone he worked with, in front of federal agents, in front of a captain whose respect he had spent years building and had just destroyed in the span of a single evening. The mayor turned from Zariah slowly, and for the first time since entering the building, he addressed the room directly, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who already knew the answer to the question he was about to ask. "Who tore the file?" he said, and it was not really a question at all. Nobody answered immediately, though every eye in the room shifted, almost involuntarily, toward Derek, who still stood near the desk with the torn folder resting beside him, like an accusation made physical. Nathaniel walked toward him slowly, and Derek felt his knees lock in place, unable to retreat, unable to explain, unable to do anything except stand there while the weight of the evening settled fully onto his shoulders. The mayor did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the torn pages, then at Derek, then at Cole, standing a few feet away, and something in his expression made both officers understand, without a single additional word, exactly how much trouble they were now in. Victor stepped forward at that point, suggesting quietly that further conversation should happen away from the lobby, in a room where the details of the investigation could be discussed without an audience of uninvolved officers straining to overhear. What followed, in the hour that came after, revealed a story that none of the officers standing in that precinct had ever imagined themselves a part of. Zariah, it turned out, had spent nearly a decade working in the shadows of financial crime investigation, moving quietly between federal task forces, declining every promotion that would have placed her name in a public directory or attached her face to a press conference. She had turned down positions that would have doubled her salary and tripled her visibility, choosing instead to remain the kind of investigator whose name appeared nowhere except in classified filings meant for a handful of eyes. The current investigation, the one connected to the folder torn apart in the lobby, had consumed 5 years of her life, tracing a web of falsified contracts and diverted public funds that stretched across multiple city departments and touched officials whose names would have shocked anyone reading a headline about it. Had the investigation collapsed that evening, hundreds of millions of dollars in public funds would have vanished into accounts no prosecutor could have traced, the trail erased, along with the only physical documentation proving how the money had moved in the first place. Victor went on to explain how the investigation had first taken shape 5 years earlier, when a routine audit of a public works contract turned up a single inconsistency so small that most reviewers would have dismissed it as a clerical error. Zariah had not dismissed it. She had spent months tracing that one inconsistency through layers of shell companies and overlapping contracts, uncovering a pattern that repeated itself across nearly a dozen city departments, each one bleeding public money into accounts that led, eventually, back to officials whose names carried weight in rooms far more powerful than any precinct lobby. She had done this work almost entirely alone at first, operating without the recognition or resources that would come later, driven by nothing more than the conviction that the numbers did not lie, even when the people behind them did. It was only in the investigation's 3rd year that the federal task force had absorbed her findings, elevating what had begun as one woman's stubborn attention to detail into one of the largest corruption cases the region had ever seen. Elena listened to this explanation with a tightening sensation in her chest, understanding now the full weight of what her officers had nearly destroyed through nothing more than assumption and impatience. She thought of the way Cole had dismissed Zariah's identification without so much as reading it carefully, the way Derek had torn through pages without a moment's hesitation, the way an entire room full of trained officers had laughed at a woman who had spent 5 years of her life protecting the very city they were sworn to serve. Victor explained that the encrypted backups existing under federal seal would need weeks of authorization to access, weeks that could allow the officials under investigation time to notice the delay and begin covering their tracks in ways that might never be fully undone. It was, he said plainly, the closest the investigation had come to complete collapse since it began, and the reason had nothing to do with the sophistication of the criminals they were pursuing and everything to do with two officers who judged a woman by the case she carried rather than the credentials she offered. Cole's face had gone the color of old paper by the time Victor finished speaking, and for the first time all evening, he had nothing at all left to say. An internal affairs team arrived within the hour, moving through the precinct with a particular quiet efficiency that told every remaining officer this was no longer a matter that would be resolved with an internal memo and a stern warning. Cole's badge was collected first, the medal placed into an evidence bag with the same clinical detachment officers usually reserved for items belonging to suspects rather than colleagues. He was informed that he would be suspended pending a full review, his service weapon logged and removed, his access to precinct systems revoked before he had even finished processing what was happening to him. Derek's hands were cuffed, not out of any belief that he posed a physical danger, but because destruction of federal evidence carried consequences that required formal processing, regardless of how the young officer had imagined his career unfolding that morning. Elena stood nearby throughout the process, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, cooperating fully with every question the internal affairs investigators put to her, offering nothing in the way of excuses for what had happened under her command. Cole tried once to explain himself to the internal affairs investigators, insisting that any officer in his position would have demanded the same verification, that the case simply looked wrong for what it claimed to hold. One of the investigators, a quiet woman who had clearly heard every version of this excuse before, asked him plainly whether he had ever demanded the same level of verification from anyone who did not look like Zariah, and Cole had no answer that survived more than a few seconds of scrutiny. Derek, when questioned separately, admitted that he had torn the folder without truly considering what it might contain, driven mostly by the desire to seem decisive in front of a superior he had spent years trying to impress. He said quietly that he wished someone had told him to slow down before he acted, though even as he said it, he understood that the responsibility for that failure belonged to him alone. Elena listened to both interviews from an adjoining office, her arms crossed, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from watching an institution she had spent her career defending reveal a flaw she had somehow never fully confronted before that night. The atmosphere inside the precinct had shifted entirely from the mocking energy of earlier that evening into something heavier, quieter, the particular silence that settles over a room once everyone finally understands the scale of a mistake that cannot be undone with an apology. Officers who had laughed along with Cole's jokes now stood at a careful distance, unwilling to meet Derek's eyes as he was led toward a holding vehicle that would take him to a facility very different from the one he had reported to that morning. Zariah watched the proceedings without any visible satisfaction, no flicker of vindication crossing her face, even as the men who had humiliated her were stripped of the authority they had wielded so carelessly just hours before. When a young officer near the door asked her quietly whether she wanted to say anything to Cole before he was taken away, she simply shook her head and said, in a voice too soft for anyone but those nearest her to hear, that she did not want revenge. She wanted the work to continue, she said, because the work had always mattered more to her than anyone's punishment ever could. Zariah herself spent much of those first days working alongside the technicians rather than resting, insisting that her handwritten annotations, the very details that made the physical file irreplaceable, needed to be reconstructed from memory, as precisely as possible while the details were still fresh. She worked through the nights with a steadiness that impressed even the federal analysts accustomed to long hours, cross-referencing digital fragments against her own recollection of 5 years of investigative work, rebuilding piece by piece what careless hands had destroyed in a matter of seconds. Victor visited the reconstruction team on the second night and later admitted that watching her work, calm and methodical, even after everything she had endured, taught him more about resilience than any courtroom victory ever had. By the third day, investigators had recovered enough material to resume the case with only minor gaps. Gaps that Zariah herself worked tirelessly to fill, using notes she had kept discreetly and separately, precisely because she had long ago learned never to trust a single point of failure with work this important. In the days that followed, federal technicians worked around the clock to reconstruct what had been lost, drawing on encrypted digital backups that existed precisely because investigators like Zariah understood the risks of carrying physical evidence through unpredictable environments. The reconstruction was not instant, requiring careful verification to ensure that every reassembled document matched the chain of custody standards necessary for eventual prosecution, but within 72 hours, the investigation was moving forward again, delayed but not destroyed. Arrests began quietly at first. Officials pulled from city offices in ones and twos, their names appearing in press releases that grew longer and more detailed with each passing week as the full scope of the corruption scheme came into public view. City council members, who had spent years signing off on inflated contracts, found themselves facing federal charges, and the money that had once vanished into shell accounts began, slowly, to be traced back to its origin. Mayor Cross held a press conference 11 days after the incident in the precinct lobby, and this time, he did not wait for reporters to ask about the woman at the center of the investigation. He named her himself. Dr. Zariah Monroe has spent years protecting this city's finances without asking for a single moment of public recognition, he told the assembled press, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. He described, in careful terms, that respected the boundaries of what remained classified, the scale of what she had uncovered, and the personal cost of the anonymity she had chosen in order to do the work properly. Members of the public, who had never heard her name before that morning, learned, over the course of a single news cycle, that the quiet woman with the worn leather case had spent half a decade standing between their tax dollars and the officials who had tried to steal them. Local news broadcasts replayed grainy security footage from the precinct lobby alongside carefully worded statements from the mayor's office, and for a few days, the story dominated every channel and every front page across the region. An unusual amount of attention for a woman who had spent her entire career trying to avoid exactly that kind of visibility. Letters arrived at the federal building addressed simply to Dr. Monroe, some from strangers thanking her for work they barely understood, others from city employees, who had long suspected something was wrong within their departments, but had never known who to trust with their suspicions. She read every one of them, though she answered almost none, preferring instead to let her continued work speak for itself in the quiet, unglamorous way it always had. Elena, watching the press coverage unfold from her office in the days that followed, found herself replaying the events of that rainy evening over and over, searching for the exact moment when things might have gone differently, had anyone in the room simply paused long enough to ask a better question. She requested, and was granted, additional training resources for her division, insisting that what had happened under her command would not be allowed to happen again through simple negligence, dressed up as procedure. Officers who had laughed along with Cole that evening were quietly required to complete additional coursework on implicit bias and evidence handling, a consequence far smaller than what Cole and Derek faced, but a consequence nonetheless, one that several of them carried with visible discomfort for months afterward. The precinct itself, once known mostly for its efficiency, became known instead, at least for a while, as the place where a federal investigation had nearly collapsed because two officers judged a woman by the bag she carried rather than the badge she never needed to raise her voice to prove she had earned. A reporter near the front of the room raised her hand near the end of the conference, waiting for the mayor to acknowledge her, and asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind since the story first broke. "Why?" she asked, looking directly at Zariah, who stood quietly near the podium, had she remained silent while officers tore apart the evidence she had spent years protecting. Zariah stepped forward slightly, and the room fell quiet, in a way it had not for any of the officials who spoke before her. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her voice carrying the same calm certainty it had held in the precinct lobby weeks earlier. "A person who knows they are right does not need to shout to prove it," she said, and the words settled over the room with a weight that made even the most hardened reporters pause before writing them down. She explained that she had trusted the systems built precisely for moments like the one she faced that rainy evening, systems designed to withstand exactly the kind of careless destruction that had nearly derailed years of careful work. Panic, she said, would have accomplished nothing. except giving the men who doubted her one more reason to believe their assumptions had been correct in the first place. Silence in that moment had been its own form of strength, the kind that did not require an audience to validate it. Outside the building, where the press conference had taken place, the rain that had defined the city for weeks finally broke. Sunlight cutting through the clouds for the first time in what felt like a very long season. Zariah walked out into that light, without any of the fanfare that usually accompanied public figures, leaving a major announcement, declining the offers of interviews that trailed after her from reporters hoping for one more. Quote, Mayor Cross watched her go from the top of the steps, standing beside Victor Hale, both men quiet for a moment, as the crowd slowly dispersed into the newly sunlit afternoon. Victor finally broke the silence between them, saying that what had happened over the past weeks was not simply the salvation of a single investigation, though it had certainly been that. It was, he said, something larger than any one case, a reminder of what it cost when trust was extended so unevenly, and what it meant to finally see that trust repaired, however imperfectly, however late. In the months that followed, the consequences of that rainy evening rippled outward through the department in ways few officers could have anticipated when the night began with nothing more than a woman and a worn leather case. Sergeant Travis Cole was formally terminated after a review board found that his conduct had directly endangered a federal investigation of historic scale, his decades of service unable to shield him from the consequences of a judgment he had made in less than 3 seconds and never bothered to question. Officer Derek Mills faced formal charges for the destruction of federal evidence. His promising early career reduced to court dates and depositions, a cautionary story other young officers would hear about for years to come during their training. The department overhauled its procedures for handling classified materials entirely, instituting new verification protocols that required any officer questioning federal credentials to escalate immediately to a superior, rather than acting on personal judgment alone. Mayor Cross signed new citywide regulations governing officer conduct and accountability within weeks of the press conference, legislation that bore, in its opening clause, direct reference to the incident that had nearly cost the city everything it had worked 5 years to protect. Dr. Zariah Monroe declined every award offered to her in the aftermath, every ceremony, every opportunity to stand before cameras and accept the recognition that so many believed she had finally earned. She returned instead to the quiet work that had defined her career long before that rainy evening brought her name into public view, disappearing once again into the careful, unglamorous labor of tracing money through systems designed to hide it. Those who worked alongside her in the years that followed said she rarely spoke of the incident at all, treating it not as a triumph to be celebrated, but as a reminder of how fragile trust could be, how easily assumption could unravel years of careful work in the span of a single evening. She believed, as she had told the reporter outside the mayor's press conference, that justice carried more weight than recognition ever could, and that the truest measure of the work was not whether the world noticed it, but whether it was done correctly regardless of who was watching. Colleagues who worked beside her in the years that followed noticed small things that never made it into any news report. The way she still carried an old case, though a newer one had been offered to her many times, the way she still arrived quietly and left quietly, refusing every attempt to turn her into a symbol rather than a professional, simply doing her job with care. When younger investigators asked her, occasionally, how she had managed to remain so calm while watching years of her work torn apart in front of a room full of strangers, she would tell them the same thing every time. That panic never once helped uncover a hidden account or trace a falsified signature, and that the work had taught her patience long before that evening ever tested it. Sergeant Cole, in the months following his termination, gave a single interview to a local paper in which he admitted, with evident difficulty, that he had judged Zariah within the first few seconds of seeing her and had never once reconsidered that judgment until it was far too late to matter. He said he thought often about the sound the folder made when it tore, a sound he described as somehow louder in memory than it had actually been in the room that night. Derek, awaiting the resolution of his own legal proceedings, took a job outside law enforcement entirely, telling a former colleague that he no longer trusted himself to make the kind of split-second decisions the job required, not after watching how badly his instincts had failed him on a single rainy evening. Neither man ever spoke with Zariah again, though both, in their own separate and imperfect ways, carried the lesson of that night with them for the rest of their careers. The rain returned to Seattle within days, as it always did, but something in the city had shifted permanently, a quiet understanding, settling into its institutions, that the next person to walk through those doors, carrying an old case and an unassuming coat, might be carrying something the whole city depended on, and that this time, someone would think twice before tearing it apart.